Content warning: this story contains references to kidnapping, physical violence, and emotional abuse. Some scenes are implied rather than shown in detail. If these topics are difficult for you, consider watching later. They put the photo on her chest and called it proof. The crowd leaned in, phones up like jury gavels. A single image, bright on a tiny screen, cut through the room and left her breathless. He stood beside her then, not the man she loved, but the man who was supposed to defend her, and for a second, the world became a place she did not recognize. She cried. It was small and public and devastating. Rain streaked down her cheeks as if the sky itself wanted to wash away what had been done. People whispered, flashbulbs popped, social feeds detonated. The caption was elegant cruelty in 3 words. Caught in lies. This is Sophia Romano. Not the rumor, not the headline, but the woman inside the story. Stubborn, precise, private. She is the jade pendant around her neck, a thin bracelet threaded with a past she doesn't tell most people. She is the daughter who once learned to read ledgers in the back room of a closed store. She is someone who remembers Elena Lynn's handwriting in a long-buried box, a name that looks like a map to a life someone else tried to erase. Who would have thought a single stolen image could tilt the world? Who would have thought that betrayal could be so public, so engineered, so final-seeming? The answer, it turns out, is not simply one man's weakness. It's a carefully assembled plan. The night of the gala had been scheduled for months. The Farah family used these events like a blade with velvet. Charity on the surface, a boardroom on the inside. Damien Farah wore a tux the way a king wears an emblem. He laughed. He kissed Sophia's hand before walking into the room. For 3 seasons, people watched them together. Couple of the Year stories, magazine profiles, a ring she'd accepted privately in a hotel room 3 weeks earlier. The engagement was supposed to be the end of all doubts. Instead, it was where the doubt began. The image came from nowhere, as these things do. An anonymous message on Damien's phone during the speech, an image passed in a corner. Someone cleared their throat and held the screen up like a verdict. It was convincing. A woman in an apartment, a hand over a face, and a bracelet that looked, from a distance, like Sophia's. The room stopped breathing. Damien's eyes, tight with 1,000 conflicts, flicked to her. Not apology, not defense. He glanced toward the edge of the crowd, where his sister, Isabella, sat with that slow, satisfied smile that had become more dangerous than open hostility. Isabella's fingers tapped a rhythm on the arm of her chair. Matteo, Damien's younger brother, scowled like a man watching a chess piece fall where he did not want it to. Someone said, "Is that her?" And the words slid through the night like glass. Sophia felt the air go thin. Her hand lifted to her pendant without thinking. The jade was cool, heavy with a story she never spoke aloud. Elena Lynn's name tucked inside a locket papered with a date. Her mind did one of the only things it knew how to do. Note details, store them, turn them into questions for later. She remembers the scent of the room, white roses, expensive cologne, a hint of lemon cleaner. She remembers Damien's thumb pressing into his phone. She remembers the way her manager, the charity director, shoved a tissue toward her like a peace offering she never asked for. She remembers walking out into the rain when it became intolerable, the city lights smeared into watercolor behind the fall. Outside, the silence was harsher. An umbrella snapped in half nearby. A group of cameras waited like beasts. The city's gossip feeds began to churn. A whisper becomes a thread becomes a rope. Later, there would be interviews and lawyers and statements that began with no comment. There would be denials and accusations and a messy public attempt at damage control. But that night, there was simply a photograph and a man who did not move quickly enough to defend her. Damien's hesitation didn't look like cowardice at first. It looked like a calculation. He was between the woman he loved and the family name he had been groomed to protect. For a moment, only a moment, Sophia saw him as someone trying to choose between fire and flood. She hoped he would choose her. He did not. The next 48 hours were a war of whispers. People who had once toasted them together now sat on opposite sides of a rumor. Columns were written. The charity postponed the gala's follow-up dinner. Damien delivered a statement through his publicist. It was careful and it avoided the ugly detail everyone wanted. Isabella posted an ambiguous photo of perfectly folded napkins. Matteo made calls that Sophia would later discover were not meant to help. And beneath the social fractures, new gears turned. Bank accounts moved, contracts were re-signed, security footage vanished. A man named Javier Stowe, always polite, always smiling, started getting texts he'd engineered to reach the right ears. Another name, Julian Stowe, appeared in the margins, less visible but present in the way men like him always are, behind the work, in the shadows, counting small favors owed and unpaid. Sophia felt a cold corridor open under her feet. She was an expert in numbers. She could spot a misplaced decimal in a ledger and find the thread that led to a fraud. But this was not a simple miscalculation. The evidence against her had been tailored to match her. The bracelet, the angle of the photo, the timestamp that matched a night she had been at a company retreat. Everything fit neatly into an accusation. The first person she called was Ken. Ken had been in her life so long he felt like furniture, steady, unshowy, the kind of friend who kept his hands clean and his loyalty private. They met as teenagers at a summer job building stages for local bands. He knew how to make a mean espresso and how to file a complaint that landed on the right desk. Ken answered on the second ring, and his voice was all practical calm as she told him the skeleton of what happened. "Stay put," he said. "Let me come to you." He arrived with a messenger bag and 3 hard truths. The first, the photo was not just a leak, it was an attack. The second, someone had access to images from the charity event and had planted that photo among the rest. The third, this was bigger than infidelity. It was corporate sabotage dressed as personal scandal. People wanted her out of the way. Why? She asked. She had thought the reasons might be as simple as greed or jealousy. Ken's expression hardened. Because you're standing on a piece of ground someone else wants. Because someone wants the out-of-the-way woman to stay out of the way. He didn't say Elena Lynn aloud then, but she saw the look, the recognition that her family name, whispered in certain rooms, made other people uneasy. Her fingers tightened around the pendant until the jade hurt. 2 days later, an op-ed made the rounds. It was written by someone who presented themselves as a disgruntled insider, and it painted a picture of a woman playing a role she didn't deserve. The Farah board met. A private meeting was held where the word vulnerability was used like a blade. Damien appeared to be doing what those around him applauded, choosing the empire over the woman who loved him. Humiliation is not a single event, it is cumulative. The first night, she felt it as shock. The week after, she felt it as thinning skin, as if everything she touched slipped away. The charity lost donors. A small boutique that carried her favorite scarf stopped returning calls. And then the nastiness changed lanes. A black SUV followed her for 3 blocks. A man she didn't recognize sidled close in a coffee shop and asked in a voice that tried to be casual, "Are you feeling okay?" He knew the details of her schedule. He knew when she met with Damien. He was polite enough to be menacing. Then there was the night at the hospital. She had been walking home after a late meeting with a lawyer who had asked too many questions and offered too little protection. The street was dim, the kind of city dark that eats sound. 2 men stepped from an alley and took her in a way that had nothing to do with gentleness. She struggled, and later, in a hospital bed, the nurse would tell her she had been lucky that security found her before something worse had happened. She would remember only flashes, hands, the sting of a slap, a voice saying, "You don't belong here," and the sound of a car door slamming shut. Police reports were filed. The detectives were careful but underfunded. They were good at the mechanical things, and not always good at the politics threading through the Farah empire. Damien showed up at the emergency entrance that night, late, breathless, with a face that spoke of limits. He did not take her hand at first. He looked like a man who had run out of words. He should have been there, people said later, and it was true. But presence sometimes arrives late, and absence leaves a mark. In the days that followed, the story hardened into a simple narrative in the public eye. A beautiful engagement derailed by a scandalous affair. The nuance, AI forgeries, political power plays, a network of men who trafficked in favors and favors owed, was invisible beneath the loud, easy story. The easier narrative was what sold. People wanted to hold the single photograph and call it truth. Sophia suffered, she also watched. If trauma narrows the world, it sometimes sharpens perception. She went back to basics. Examine, document, preserve. She stopped sleeping more than she needed to. She started to notice small things police and executives overlooked. A cleaned-up security feed that left a missing minute, an invoice stamped with an older account number, a charity ledger that had a line item that insisted on being wrong. She believed, with the stubbornness of someone who has to, that truth could be reconstructed like a torn photograph if you found the missing piece. But there were other forces at work. Isabella Farrar, the sister who had orchestrated social slights for years, had a smile like a closed door. She hosted the parties where alliances were made and broke them with the same casual motion. She had a way of placing people where they would be most useful. Isabella had always considered Sophia a temporary presence at best, an actress in the Farrar plays who might be useful for one scene and should leave quietly afterward. Matteo, meanwhile, rubbed his hands at every misstep. He wanted the family's attention and resented the woman who had gone from being an outsider to being engaged to the heir. He texted his friends, made private bets on when the engagement would collapse, and his bitterness made him careless. He was not a villain in the classic sense. He was smoldering envy in a tailored suit. And then there were the Stowe brothers, Javier and Julian. Publicly, they were service providers, facilitators of security, technology, and certain exchanges nobody liked to talk about too loudly. Privately, they were operators. They had access to the mechanisms that could create or destroy reputations. They had the technical team, the ghost accounts, the men who knew how to push a narrative and pull a string. Sophia's discovery of them was almost accidental. She found a payment thread in a ledger that had been copied months before the gala. It seemed routine, office supplies, event staging, but the recipient was a shell company with a name that meant nothing. The account leading to that company, however, glowed like a neon sign in her mind. A transfer tag to a Soto account 2 summers earlier, routed through an intermediary in a different country. The handwriting in the ledger was neat. Someone had tried very hard to make it look plain. That night, she crawled into bed and looked at the pendant at her throat. Eleanor Lynn's name was a ghost in the bootstrap of a life she had tried to build on her own merit. She was not ready to be a symbol. She wanted to be a person with agency. She decided quietly that she would not be erased. The first move was small and anticlimactic, a request for a copy of a security footage file from the night of the gala. You would think it trivial. It wasn't. The people who rewrote the narrative had been careful. They also, like most conspirators, underestimated a woman who remembered how to read the margins of a ledger. When Ken came back with a flash drive and a pair of eyes that had not yet been corrupted by headlines, they worked through the night. The footage, at first glance, was dull. Guests arriving, a cluster at the center stage, Damien delivering his line. But then Ken slowed it down. He scanned frame by frame and found a blip, an interruption in the feed around the timing of the photo. A minute and 12 seconds that were blank. Blank, as in removed. Blank, as in tampered with. Someone wanted that minute gone, Ken said. They wanted nobody to remember who walked out of the room when the picture was taken. Sophia's heart thudded in her ears. If they had removed footage, what else had they altered? How many minutes in her life had been quietly edited? The ledger thread and the missing footage were small puzzle pieces. Together they began to form a disturbing picture. A network with access to tech, to money, and to the priceless commodity of plausible deniability. Someone on the inside had buttoned the scandal tight around her like a corset. She thought of Elena Lynn then, the woman whose name she carried like a folded letter. There had been rumors, quiet ones, that Elena had been cut out of something big decades ago, a family feud, an inheritance quietly redirected, an adoption record that disappeared. There were names that surfaced in old newspaper clippings, Ricardo Lynn among them, and a set of signatures in faded ink that matched the way power sometimes passes like a whispered legacy. If Sophia had been born into the Lynn lineage, if she carried a paper claim or a bloodline nobody wanted to account for, she understood why people would be determined to make her small. The room an empire reserves for convenient women is not the room someone takes kindly to when she starts asking questions. She would later learn that some of that narrative was indefinido, records missing, claims murky, stories half told and half buried. For now she held the pendant, and the thought of a lost name kept her awake. The first public pushback came as a quiet stunt. A blogger, one of those agreeable rumor mills, published a time-stamped sequence of images that suggested the photo had been taken in an apartment the week before. The blogger tied Sophia to an address and delivered what people wanted: certainty. Damien's team circulated the same images with a deniable caption. The world stitched them together and turned truth into threadbare fabric. Sophia fought back in the only way she could. She requested a formal audit of the gala's security and a review of the charity's image files. She reached out to a lawyer who had defended her friend from a similar smear campaign. She reached out to a woman who had once worked in the photo lab of a small-town newspaper and still knew how to read pixels the way others read faces. Everyone she called gave her small, steady steps forward and an exhausting list of reasons she might be too late. Then, at 3 a.m, as the city slept and the headlines turned to currency, Damien called. His voice had the frayed quality of a man who had been considering everything and deciding to do very little. He spoke in sentences that tried to be steady. He did not apologize at first. He avoided the accusation like a landmine. He asked her to come to his office to talk. "It's complicated," he said. "Let's talk in person." Sophia felt the old ache of wanting someone to meet her where she was, to gather the broken pieces and help her rebuild them. But she also felt the new steel of someone who had been pushed against a wall and had risen with a different question. Who stands behind the camera? When she arrived at the glass-walled office, Damien received her with a distance she could not cross. He had always been good at compartmentalizing, his face red like a man conducting negotiations, part regret, part calculation. He reached for her hand like a script he had memorized too late. "There are things you don't know," he said. "Things I can't say right now." "And I know you," she heard herself reply. "You're afraid." He flinched at the word, not because it was wrong, but because the accusation landed with the weight of truth. Damien was complicated. He loved power as if it were oxygen. He loved her sometimes like a ghost remembers the scent of a room. He had faults that were human: hesitation, diplomacy, a desire to protect something he did not want to lose. That night, it was painfully clear that what he wanted to protect was more often the Farah name than the woman who had promised to marry him. Then he did something she did not expect. He slid a sheet of paper across the desk with a bank transfer listed on it, small, routine, and wrong. The transfer didn't match the story he had told in public. He blamed logistics. He blamed a poor accounting department. He did not blame the men who had signed the checks. "I'll help you," he said in a voice that tried to be certain, "but we need to be careful." Sophia watched him. She wanted to believe he meant it. She also wanted him to be brave enough to say the right thing in the right loud room, not just in a private one. She needed proof. She needed strategy. They parted with a promise that felt like a stopgap rather than resolution. He went back into the warm glow of the empire. She walked in the cold clarity of the street, clutching the paper like a breadcrumb. The days swelled and broke. A disturbing turn came when a stranger slipped an envelope under her door. 3 photos, close angles. The shadows in the apartment looked staged. Someone had obsessed over proper lighting. One photograph showed a hand that, taken alone, could pass for hers. Another showed a close-up of the pendant, cropped tight so no face was visible. The final photo was a cropped version of the one at the gala, but with a different timestamp and metadata stripped. Metadata, her nightwork colleague explained, is the invisible ink of photographs. You can edit an image until it is gorgeous, but the metadata sometimes holds the secret, the camera type, the file origin, a trace of an editing tool. The photos in the envelope had been scrubbed. Someone knew how to clean a trail. Someone wanted her gone. And then she was taken. The kidnapping was not cinematic. There were no dramatic ropes or an organ soundtrack. There were small, efficient movements and an economy of violence that left only the necessary marks. She does not want the technicalities of it recited. The fact of being grabbed, moved, caged into a van, and left in a place that smelled like cleaning products and old leather is enough. What matters is the buried clause in the story. The people who did it talked like managers cleaning a process, not like men driven by rage. They were careful, businesslike. They said, "We need you quiet for a little while," and they meant for her to vanish like an aeronaut. Ken found her a day later because someone had slipped, because a ledger didn't balance, because a guard left a tracking app on a table. He broke into the place with eyes stone cold and phone calls that reached people who still kept phone numbers for inconvenient situations. The police arrived, and this time the detectives were angrier. The men who had taken her were searched and cuffed. They muttered names, Javier, Julian, names that had been in the margins of so many compromised deals. At the hospital afterwards, looking at the bruise already forming under her eye, she thought of the pendant. She held it like a talisman and felt the weight of choices ahead. There was a moment in the middle of treatment when the world asked her to play the old part. Eyes on her were curious and hungry. Reporters wanted quotes. Lawyers wanted permission to speak. Damien appeared at her bedside, but his hand hovered, uncertain, as if the hospital were another stage whose lines he had not yet memorized. "You did what you had to," he said once she could hear him properly. "You called people. You were brave." "Did you?" she asked. "When I needed you?" He swallowed. It was a human, brittle gesture. He had done things she knew. He had placed calls and sent messages. But he had not stood in a public room and said a single sentence that would have stopped the rumor in its tracks. In the court of public opinion, silence is a verdict. In the weeks that followed, Sophia lived with an impossible mix of fear and a hunger for clarity. The kidnapping had been a wake-up call, proof that this was not simply about a bad photo. It was about power. It was about people positioning chess pieces for a game where losing one piece cost someone else a kingdom. She started asking questions that made other people nervous. She asked about contracts and payments. She asked about contractors who'd been hired for the gala, about who had access to the image servers, about a name that kept surfacing in invoices, Sodto. Another name, Stowe, repeated like a chorus in the margins. The Stowe brothers' imprint was everywhere. People who had once smiled at her now shrank. That did not surprise Sophia. What surprised her were the faces that did not withdraw. Ken stayed. A few cleaners at the Farah estate slipped breadcrumbs, small details about who had given orders and when. An IT guy who owed Isabella a favor slipped a folder with a file called prints that made no sense until you opened it. Inside the folder were test prints. They looked like normal photos until someone moved the light and you saw the traces. She called the woman who knew how to read pixels. The woman's voice on the phone grew grave as she said, "This is a manipulation suite. That's AI. That's someone who wanted a photo to say what it didn't." AI. The word sounded like a clean, modern weapon. You could fake a face, paste a hand, synthesize a laugh out of a recording, and make anyone sound guilty. The forgeries were sophisticated. They were crafted by people who had access to money and technicians and men who had no moral qualms about ruining a life. Sophia felt something inside her reshape, grief uncoiling into strategy. She understood the scale of the tool being used against her. She realized that brute force would not fix this. She would need proof, and then she would need to take that proof into places that had been denied to her. She began to assemble a small, quiet coalition. Ken, who had hands that could wrench open a locked server. An IT woman who could analyze metadata. A journalist who owed her one life-saving favor. And a detective who had an honest bone left. They met in kitchens and cars, in the spaces between the public spectacles and the private betrayals. They made lists. They catalogued transfers and timestamps and the oddities that suggested interference. There were setbacks. A USB drive she'd placed in a safe disappeared from the lawyer's office. An anonymous tip led to a dead end when the caller hung up. She found out that some of the people who seemed friendly were bound by promises or greed in ways she had not measured. But she also found lines she could pull. A charity donation intended for a scholarship fund had been redirected through a Soto account. A vendor who had supposedly done floral work had records that conflicted with the invoices. An intern at the security firm said in a cafe, trembling, "I was told to delete something. I didn't want to." He handed over a file that contained the missing minute, part of it. It was damaged, corrupted, but it had audio. That audio contained a voice, a laugh, a name that meant more than it should. Sophia listened, alone, in a borrowed office, the speaker whispering a clipped conversation where two men joked about the timing of a photograph. One said, casually, "Make sure the Farah girl has the bracelet in the shot." Another laughed. The laughter was the kind of casual cruelty that feels like a slap because it implies premeditation. It was proof of intention. It was not final proof of the web that had been woven around her, but it was a crack in the armor. And then, on a Tuesday when the news cycle was thin, she got a call from someone she had almost forgotten. An old woman named Marta, who had been a housekeeper in the Lynn household before it fractured, before Eleanor Lynn's name was scrubbed from public ledgers. Marta had kept a note in a Bible for 30 years. The handwriting was smudged, the ink had faded, but the name at the top read, Ricardo Lynn. "This is for you," Marta said when she called. "You ought to know where you come from." In a small shoebox, Marta revealed letters, short, formal notes that suggested an arrangement, a companionship, and hints at money shifted in the war for legacy. It wasn't a dramatic inheritance lemma. It was paperwork and signatures. It was enough to say, there had been a Lynn, and there had been an intention to cut ties. Sophia had always suspected she was more than the convenient woman on a magazine cover. Now she had papers that suggested why others might want her quiet. The more she learned, the more dangerous she became to the people who had crafted her downfall. People who had once used a photo as a weapon were now forced to consider what happens when the weapon is turned toward the hand that wielded it. They were not men who appreciated scrutiny. That realization made her cautious, but it also made her purposeful. She began to see a plan forming in the periphery. Gather proof, expose the forgeries, follow the money, and bring the right officers into the story before people could vanish the evidence again. She would not hunt vengeance for vengeance's sake. She would hunt vindication. And yet, sitting in a dim kitchen with Ken and the IT woman that night, she felt the fatigue of a woman who had been dragged through public mud. She did not yet feel triumphant. She felt the edges of trauma, nights that woke her, hands that shook when the phone rang, a mistrust that seeped into casual conversations. Ken put his cup down and said, "You don't have to go at this alone." He meant it the way his voice always did. He would be beside her. He would turn over stones. He would keep the small lights on while she slept for a few hours. She wanted to say something heroic. She wanted to stand up and declare war. Instead, she slid off the chair and wrapped the jade pendant in a napkin and put it in her pocket. It was a quiet gesture. Keep what matters close. When she left that night, she walked past a building with a late-night news segment on a giant screen. The anchor's face was flattened by technology. His voice described her image in the neutral language of ratings. The world was hungry for spectacle. The world had a short memory for nuance. In that moment, the vow she made was small and made of necessity. She would get the audio. She would find the missing minutes. She would track the transfers. She would make the photo speak the truth about the people who made it. She would expose the men who thought they could erase a woman with a single edited frame. But there was something she had not yet anticipated. The cost of asking questions in a room full of men who had spent decades learning how to control the story. The Stowe brothers were not the only ones who knew how to erase a trace. The Farahs had their own secrets, everything from family feuds to off-books payments, and Isabella had a way of closing ranks. Damien had things to lose that might be more important to him than her name. As the rain started again that night, she looked at the screens of her phone. Messages, threats thinly veiled as concern, a link to an article that claimed she had staged the whole thing. And she understood the scale of the mountain she was about to climb. She also understood something else. He would cry in the end, she thought. Not because she wished it, but because the ledger was patient in truth, when collected piece by piece, had a way of making grown men painstakingly honest in a way their pride would not allow. That thought slid through her like a promise, neither arrogant nor petty. It was a calculation. It was the seed of a plan. She did not yet know how to assemble the first dominoes. She only knew she would not be passive while the story wrote itself for her. The phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. She answered. "Is this Sophia Romano?" a voice asked. She closed her eyes and steadied herself. "Yes." "There's something you need to know about the Stowe transfers," the voice said. "Meet me, tonight." Her pulse quickened. The night was becoming crowded with meetings and notes. She tightened her coat and checked for cameras in the reflection of a shop window. The city felt like a net. Out of the corner of her eye, a black SUV idled at the curb across the street. She could choose to walk away. She could let the men who had already broken her keep the story. She could choose to vanish, be quiet, be safe. She did not choose safety. Where? She asked. A line on the phone gave an address. It was a place she'd walked past a dozen times. An old warehouse converted into artist lofts, the kind of place that smelled faintly of turpentine and had been turned into a meeting point because it was a place people assumed would attract attention for the wrong reasons. Attention, she realized, sometimes made the right kind of cover. She told Ken where she was going, and he said a thing with fierce simplicity. If you walk into a room and feel wrong, leave. No glory in martyrdom. She laughed, a short, raw sound. Noted. At the warehouse, she met a man with a nervous smile who slid a folder across the table. Inside were wire transfers, routing numbers, and the names of shell companies. There was also a name she had not expected to see, an accountant who had done work for Isabella Ferrer in a previous era. The paper trail was not pure. It had been laundered through countries and accounts, but enough of it glowed like embers in a fireplace. You understand what this means? The nervous man said. Yes, she answered. It means they paid someone to make me disappear. He shrugged. It means they thought they could get away with it. She put the folder in her bag and felt its weight, literal and figurative. It was a first stone in the mosaic of truth. It would not take them down by itself, but it forced an exposure she had not yet dared to imagine. On the way home, she thought of Elena Lynn's name and Marta's shoebox of letters. She thought of Damien's hand hovering like a question mark. She thought of the men who had taken her. She thought of how fragile a photograph looked when stacked against a folder of transfers that looped into a Soto account. She slept poorly and dreamed of being in a room full of mirrors, each reflecting a different version of herself. In each mirror, the woman reacted differently. One surrendered, one raged, one laughed, one quietly plotted. She woke with the sense that she had to choose which reflection to trust. The first part of her plan was already moving into place without her announcing it to the world. She would collect what could not be scrubbed, bank records, witness statements, digital metadata, and she would take them to someone who could not be bought. She would not run headlines. She would make the right detectives angry enough to dig deeper. She would make the right journalists curious enough to follow the money. And she would make sure the photo that had tried to kill her life was shown for what it was, a forgery. When she reached her apartment, she found a single card slipped under her door. No message, just a paperclip shaped like a question mark. The pendant in her pocket felt suddenly heavy, and the night outside thrummed with a possibility that tasted like risk. She locked the door, checked the windows, and sat at the little kitchen table. The folder of transfers lay between her and the lamp, a small island of organized chaos. She traced a route on a printout with her finger. The path the money had taken. It wound through accounts with elegant names, shell companies, a wire to a small agency that specialized in digital image editing, then a return to neat corporate accounts. Someone had built a machinery to disassemble her life. Somewhere far away, men in suits were likely toasting quietly to their success. Somewhere closer, people who had once turned away were starting to worry. Pieces were shifting. She stood up and walked to the window. The city lights had the fragile glitter of things that could be bought or sold. In the reflection she saw herself, a woman who had cried in the rain and now sat awake, counting routes of money transfers and listening for the small telling noises that betray a conspiracy. The plan had not yet become a victory. The worst was not yet done. But in the hum of the night, she felt a small thing harden into purpose. She would not be a rumor. She would be an answer. Somewhere on a far side of the city, a man stared at his own reflection, the one who had held up the photograph. He watched himself on a screen and saw, for the first time, the tremor at the edge of his certainty. The man who had thought this would be easy felt a slow, unfamiliar dread. They would both have to make choices. He would have to decide whether to stand in the room and speak truth, or to step away and watch everything he built crack. She would have to keep moving forward, gather allies, and accept that the path to vindication would be messy and expensive and might cost more than she had imagined. And a new voice on a late-night call, the one who promised intelligence about the Stowe transfers, waited at a corner table for her to arrive. The net was tightening on the men who had crafted her fall. The city was no longer content with the photo as fact. The ledger was waking up. When she left her apartment the next morning, the pavement still held yesterday's rain. She put the pendant inside her shirt and felt the small private weight of Elena Lynn against her sternum. She walked through the morning light and thought, for the first time since the gala, of the word empowered as more than media copy. It was an armature. It was a call to gather what was lost, piece by piece. She had no illusions about the cost. She also had no illusions about staying silent. She was about to find out what the Stowe brothers had spent so much to hide. If you're hooked so far, subscribe and stay with her. This is where the plans get dangerous and the payoff gets loud. Sophia didn't rush. She moved like someone who had learned patience in the small hours when everyone else sleeps and the city forgets its story. The folder of transfers went into a locked drawer she alone had the key to. The audio clip of men laughing about the bracelet lived on an encrypted drive Ken carried like a talisman. Marta's letters slept under the mattress of a cheap motel bed, while Sophia arranged who could be trusted to hold what and when. Her strategy had 3 basic elements: corroborate, escalate, and protect. Corroborate meant turning scattered whispers into documents that could not be shrugged off. Escalate meant using the right venues, police, a responsible journalist, and a formal board setting where the Farah Empire could be forced to address facts, not rumors. Protect meant building a ring around herself and anyone willing to stand with her so the evidence could surface before it could be swept away. The first corroboration came from an unlikely place. A vendor who had provided lighting for the gala had been coaxed into telling a version of the truth by a text that simply read, "Do the right thing." He walked into the meeting at a diner with an envelope, and after coffee and 3 nervous cigarettes, he handed over a printed invoice that didn't match the contract he'd been given. The invoice had been altered. The payment had a hidden memo line that referenced event image package. He hadn't known what that meant. He had been paid and then cut out of conversation. But the ink on the printout matched lines on other documents Sophia had. Tiny patterns in a font used exclusively by a local contractor who had a reputation for doing discreet work. When the IT woman, Layla, ran the invoice through tools that smelled like magic to people who weren't used to code, a neat trail unfolded. Transfers routed through one intermediary, then another, then back into accounts linked to the Stowe brothers. Metadata, so carefully scrubbed from the photos, left a residue in the invoices. It was imperfect, but it was enough to demand attention. Sophia took it to Detective Morales because, after the kidnapping, she had decided she would not build her case only with clicks and gossip. Morales had a stubborn streak that made him useful. He listened, asked the right blunt questions, and when Sophia walked out of his office that afternoon, she felt the first flush of realness. There were cop cars in the margins now. Someone else had to follow the breadcrumbs if they wanted to keep them honest. The next autumn night when things moved was not cinematic. It began with a terse call, a voice that said 3 words and hung up. "We've got movement." Ken met her outside a courthouse with the look of a man who hadn't slept. Layla had identified a server in a third-country hosting facility used to process the forgeries. The Stowe brothers had been sloppy in translating the payments into the system, and one of the shell companies hadn't been fully anonymized. Morales coordinated with federal agents who had the jurisdiction and the grit to go after servers that liked to hide in legal limbo. A raid was planned with the kind of meticulousness that made conspirators nervous. Subpoenas were read, warrants were sealed. Sophia sat in a small glass room and breathed through the antiseptic taste of anticipation. The law moved slow and precise, the way a surgeon's hand does, and when it moved, it knocked over a lot of carefully stacked dominoes. What the agents pulled from that server was enough to make headlines if someone wanted to write them. There were scripts for image processing, invoices to obscure designers, messages between accounts requesting the Farah shot, with a tone that suggested this was routine work. There were also contracts tying a small image laundering firm to a Soto intermediary account, and crucially, a list of clients. The list contained names that made her blood run cold. Not only the Stowe brothers, but a contact who matched the name on a ledger linked to Isabella's private events and a number that pinged Damien's office. It was not smoking gun certainty. It was the kind of corroboration that raises eyebrows, and people who had previously looked away now stopped and took note. The Stowe brothers were arrested quietly in the night. They surrendered with the insolent calm of people who believed money could smooth any consequence. Their calm cracked in the interrogation room when detectives played the audio clip of the laughter and the clip of the man saying, "Make sure the Farah girl has the bracelet." They asked why the Stowe account had received transfers that matched the company names on the invoices. The brothers tried to spin stories about contractors and mistaken entries. One of them, Julian, kept looking over his shoulder like someone expecting a backhand for every lie. What followed for Sophia was not a parade. Arrests do not automatically translate into exoneration. The public appetite had already been fed a simpler story. A scandal, a broken engagement. Her lawyers cautioned patience. "We can't go on TV and shout the server names," they said. "We need a case. We need witness statements. We need documented links. You're not just clearing your name, you're asking institutions to prosecute their clients." So she built the case. Ken watched security footage with a patience that bordered on obsession until he found fragments the servers hadn't completely scrubbed. Layla ran analysis on the photos and produced a report that read like a slow dismantling of a forgery. Layered elements inconsistent with the camera type, shadows that refused to match expected angles, compression artifacts that betrayed a composite. Morales got a quiet confession from a low-level technician who'd been paid too little for too much secrecy, and who, in a moment of fear, decided the truth would be preferable to a long sentence. Every new piece of evidence forced Isabella to adjust her smile. Damien, who had spent weeks sitting in a no-man's land between denial and action, found himself cornered in a room he had never wanted to enter. The Farah board demanded answers as their stock wobbled and donors reconsidered. A few large partners threatened to pull charitable gifts if the family did not show decisive, transparent action. The publicist machine that had once cleansed images and scheduled favorable interviews began to stutter. Sophia never lost her rhythm, even when fatigue threatened. There were setbacks. A key witness recanted under pressure from a lawyer who smelled family power. A USB Ken had smuggled into a safe disappeared for 24 hours and turned up in a place that suggested someone had read it. A reporter who had promised to run a story put it on hold when his editor feared a defamation suit. Those moments could have flattened a less determined woman. They hardened her. Then came the breakthrough that made the public confrontation inevitable. An audit of the gala's security system produced a backup file, stored accidentally on a contractor's personal cloud account that had escaped the initial erasure. The file contained the missing minute and 12 seconds Ken had first noticed. In those frames, viewed in slow motion, a figure emerges from the periphery of the crowd. Not just a random guest, but a woman who, when her coat moves, reveals a glint of a pendant. The angle wasn't perfect enough to be the photo itself, but it showed movement, a hand passing, a staging that suggested the photo had been set up with intent. Layla's enhancement made the scene legible. The audio, once cleaned, revealed a whisper. "Make sure she's the one." It was not a full confession. It was a directed action. It placed intent at the feet of people who had argued in private rooms that someone must be removed. Armed with that file, Sophia and her team did something deliberate. They moved the confrontation into the public square. They wouldn't simply leak the footage. They arranged for a formal presentment, a press conference scheduled at the courthouse with Detective Morales, a trusted investigative journalist named Ryan who had a reputation for meticulous work, and a lawyer who would not bow to envelopes of hush money. The plan was to present the evidence to the police and the public at once, forcing institutions to be accountable in a way the rumor mill had not been. On the morning of the presentation, the air felt surgical. Cameras lined the steps like silent witnesses. Isabella arrived early in her practiced armor, a monochrome dress and a face that could not hide impatience. Matteo flitted between reporters with a practiced smile that read closer to a win than a concern. Damien came last, as if arriving late would keep him free of consequence. He stood a step behind his sister, waiting for the tide to dictate his movement. Sophia, flanked by Ken and Layla, walked up those courthouse steps with something that had nothing to do with vanity. It was purpose. The crowd quieted as Morales spoke. They had enough probable cause to investigate and to pursue the arrests. The server logs, the invoices, the enhanced footage. These were all pieces of a puzzle pointing at a campaign of manipulation. The press exploded with questions. Someone shouted, "Is this about the engagement?" Someone else asked if there were civil suits. Sophia said nothing at first. She let the facts stand where they could not be contradicted by a smiling photograph. When the journalist asked her how it felt to be vindicated, she chose her words like a woman who had spent months practicing steadiness. "It feels like the beginning of accountability," she said. "Not vindication yet, but it means the truth is no longer theirs to manufacture." Her voice had the wire edge of someone who had been trained in sorrow and had come out the other side with tools. The world would say later that those words were magnanimous. The truth was less tidy. She wanted justice. She wanted to stop men from laughing about her wrist while they arranged to erase her. She wanted the men who had made her disappear to be held in a way that meant they couldn't be hired again to do the same to someone else. The press conference forced hands. The Stowe brothers were now public defendants. Investigations widened. Journalists began to unspool the financial threads into long reads that made the public understand how reputations are bought and sold. The board convened emergency meetings. Donations paused. Isabella's network shivered. The boardroom confrontation that would become the public spectacle Sophia had been building toward didn't have to be a theatrical ambush. She wanted it to be clean and incontrovertible. The FARA board had scheduled a session to address governance and public relations. She requested to attend as a stakeholder, and, with the support of Morales and Ryan's promise to hold space, they allowed it. This was the moment to place the evidence before the very people whose silence had once protected the rumor. She arrived with a slim binder, copies of the server logs, invoices, Layla's forensic report on the photos, the cleaned-up video, and the martyr letters that established a motive for those who had wanted her silenced. She had Morales at the doorway and a police officer waiting in the wings in case intimidation turned physical. She had Ken nearby in the gallery, and Ryan with a recorder and an editorial team streaming part of the meeting to a reputable news outlet. Inside the boardroom, the air smelled of polished wood and old money. A dozen faces looked at her with varying shades of curiosity and calculation. Isabella smiled as if the thing was still a casual inconvenience. Matteo smirked. Damien sat with his hands folded and a look that suggested he had prepared a speech of calibrated remorse. Sophia didn't begin with fireworks. She started with the ledger. She went through the invoices, narrating the path of a payment that wound through shell companies and territories. Her tone was clinical. Her hand did not tremble. When she placed the cleaned video on the table and played it, the room tilted. The clip was short and unembellished, but it made the choreography of the fabricated photo visible. The whispering men, the staged movement, the hand that ensured a bracelet flashed in the camera's frame. She watched Isabella's face change. The smile became a mask. Matteo's hands, which had been languid, tightened around his pen. Damien's complexion shifted. He was losing control of a narrative he had let others write for him. When she finished, she did not demand a verdict from the room. She asked a simple question into the hush. Who authorized the edits? Who paid for this work? Her eyes landed on Isabella in a way that suggested she had been asked this before, in private rooms whose walls whispered. Isabella's answer was a study in deliberate evasions. She spoke of miscommunications and vendors and a team that handled digital collateral. She called the payments oddities and blamed contractors. Her words were polished and plausible. The board debated. Some expressed shock and called for independent tribunals. Others said they needed more time. It could have stayed there. It could have lapsed back into procedural slow dance. But there was one thing Isabella had not expected. Detective Morales had prepared witnesses. The technician who had confessed to altering metadata sat quietly at the end of the room, willing to say the words in public that had tremblingly begun in closed interviews. He said plainly that he'd been paid to remove traces and told specifically to make the FARA photograph convincing. He named a contractor. He named Julian Stumber. Isabella's face went pale, the shade of expensive paper. The room no longer had a space for casual smiles. Damien, who had sat like a man hoping to be protected by the machinery of family deference, rose then as if the seat of privilege was searing him. He quoted lines he had practiced in private interviews, protocols, loyalty, a trust in processes. But when Morales asked if Damien had authorized any payments connected to the Stowe accounts, Damien's answer was a stammer. He admitted to making a payment to an intermediary to expedite logistics, a euphemism his publicist would later try to clean, and he admitted the transfer's memo line had been misinterpreted. His confession was not of full complicity, it was of a cowardice many could fathom, prioritizing organizational reputation over a single woman's name. His eyes met Sophia's, and for the first time in months, there was no manager or publicist to smooth the edges between them. There was only two people in a room, and one of them had been wronged and the other had been cautious. "I thought I was protecting the company," Damien said, voice small enough that someone in the back leaned forward. I didn't realize they would do this. I should have said something. I should have stood up." The admission had a ripple. For some, it was a human confession. For others, it was too little, too late. Damien's role complicated the narrative in a way the tabloids loved and the moralists despised. He had been neither a monster nor a hero. He was a man who preferred the safety of a plan to the risk of a messy defense. But there were consequences. The board voted to suspend several contracts pending investigation. Isabella was placed on administrative leave while the internal audit continued. Damien was asked to step down temporarily from a committee. The Stowe brothers faced additional indictments, and press thrummed with the idea of fallibility in high places. The world loves a reversal. What it dislikes is nuance. But the room Sophia left that day carried the scent of accountability in a way the rain in the first part of her story had not. It was not an end. It was a turning point. The fall of the Stowe brothers was only partial. In court they pled a combination of things: coerced contracts, hired technicians, and a desire to protect clients. The judiciary does not always move at the speed of outrage, but the federal prosecutors were interested in money trails and a pattern of organized mischief. The men who had taken her were charged as accessories in the broader conspiracy that had sought to erase a woman's life to protect a network of interests. Isabella fought legally and with the particular ferocity that comes from someone raised to believe in her own invincibility. She denied orchestrating the smear. She painted herself as a victim of poor bookkeeping. Matteo spun into quieter bitterness, his smirks turning inward as alliances shifted. Damien's public apology tried to fold regret into an admission of imperfect judgment. He meant the words earnestly. The people who had been watching wanted more than feelings. What mattered most, though, was what the law began to admit into evidence: that a narrative had been manufactured and then weaponized. That alone did not restore everything she had lost. The boutique that refused her calls did not instantly reopen. The gossip threads did not instantly terminate. There is no instant fix for the erosion of trust. But the machinery of power that had built the photograph was now visible to those same institutions that had breathed it into life. There were private moments that were smaller and sharper than any public victory. Sophia sat in a modest hearing room one afternoon while a statement she had written was read aloud. She watched a man who used to show while publicists set the angles of his face, the man who had been the center of her shame, meet her gaze and break down. It was not a melodramatic collapse. It was a quiet, terrible cracking of someone who saw, finally, the cost of his choices. Damien's voice broke when he spoke to her in private after a hearing that had become more about truth than image. He said haltingly, "I thought I was preserving something important for everyone. I didn't understand how much it cost you." Sophia listened. She had no desire to perform his absolution. She had been at the edge of an abyss and had pulled herself back. She had been the one who had to make the calls, assemble evidence, and avoid mistakes that would let the men who'd done this off the hook. Compassion was not a free ticket to forgive. "I'm glad you understand now," she said. "But understanding isn't enough. We need accountability. We need reckoning." He wept there in a way that the tabloids would later describe as a broken fiancé, and the comment sections would call bile. He wept because he had loved the idea of power more than the person who loved him, and that realization unspooled him. Whether that led to redemption was a question that would be answered only by time and action. The public unmasking of the Stowe operation and the subsequent incriminating invoices pushed Isabella into the limelight for reasons she had not planned. Old friends distanced themselves. The Farah board's patience thinned. Matteo's petty satisfactions could not outweigh a growing fear that the family name was in jeopardy. Isabella watched as the world she had bent to her will developed small fissures. The final collapse of the plot was less dramatic than a single courtroom moment and more like the slow erosion of a dam. Vendors that had once been loyal to Isabella refused to support her when subpoenas arrived. Witnesses who had been bought returned to their consciences when the law came for them. The more documents surfaced, contracts showing payments for image services, internal emails referencing controlling the narrative, the less plausible Isabella's denials became. When the full picture began to fit, the people who had once mocked Sophia's tears found their voices narrowed. The public became less interested in a photograph and more interested in the question: how did power enable that photograph to matter? Newspapers ran long features on the industry of reputation laundering. Podcasts dissected the ethical implications of AI-generated evidence. People who had once been willing to click on a scandal began to wonder how they could have been so quick to believe. And then, in a hearing streamed for legal transparency, Detective Morales walked through a timeline that was methodical and devastating. He pinned certain actions to certain people with documents, invoices, recorded calls, and sworn statements. He did not yell. He did not theatrically throw a binder on a table. He walked the room through cause and effect. And the effect was that a carefully crafted public lie had become, in the light of evidence, an organized fraud. Isabella's composure failed in front of a camera she could not buy off. She sat with her arms folded and a face that had practiced outrage before it practiced vulnerability. The board of the charity withdrew its endorsement from several family-controlled accounts. The Farah name, once fastened in golden letters on gala invitations, looked tarnished. The Stowe brothers faced sentencing that carried consequences tuned to the scale of their actions. They pleaded guilty to some counts, others went to trial. Julian, who had seemed so comfortable in the shadows, sat and watched as people he'd thought disposable walked away free while he took the legal fall. His earlier arrogance curdled into a brittle regret that did not redeem him. What about Damien? He lost more than stature. He lost the illusion that his choices were consequence-free. In one of the most public moments of the fallout, he addressed the press with a voice that shook. He apologized. He named his cowardice, admitted his failures, and acknowledged the pain he had allowed. When a reporter pressed him about contractual details that linked his office to intermediary payments, his hands trembled. The same man who had once stood next to Sophia at the gala now faced a sentence of public shame. There is a private cruelty to watching someone you once loved unravel. It feels like being forced to watch a storm you could not stop. Sophia felt a complicated thing, not joy. Empathy mixed with a satisfaction that justice was moving. She had no need to see him destroyed. She needed the truth to be an instrument of repair, not vengeance. But truth runs a parallel track to retribution. Sometimes it leads to both. In the weeks after the hearings, Sophia rebuilt with careful, intentional steps. She did not immediately reclaim the social positions she had lost. Instead, she focused on work that mattered in a different currency: trust. Instead of chasing weddings and headlines, she met with women who had been targets of similar campaigns. She started a small non-profit initiative aimed at helping people affected by digital forgery and smear campaigns, a practical support system for legal and emotional recovery, funded partly by donors who felt ugly about having followed the original scandal and now wanted to do better. She also reclaimed property that was less about money than identity. She worked with legal counsel to secure the documents Marta had given her, formalizing any legitimate claims to what remained of the Lynn legacy. Whether a formal inheritance would result in anything significant was indefinido in certain details and would require careful legal steps. But claiming lineage in paper and public acknowledgement shifted the balance. People who had once insisted she was an opportunist now had to account for why they had tried so hard to erase Elena Lynn's name. The mere act of naming a truth is often the first step to changing power. Sophia's comeback was not a blaze of vindictive triumph. It was a sequence of small, inevitable reckonings. She returned to the world with a clarity that did not erase the nights she'd been dragged through rumor, but did reorient her toward a future that was hers to hold. She refused offers to be a martyr or a spectacle. She accepted invitations to testify, to speak on panels about digital forensics, and to host a few televised conversations about ethics and power. In time, she became less a headline of pity and more a resource for others. Damien's arc took a different, lonelier path. He resigned from several committees and retreated from the relentless brightness of the social scene. His tears, those moments captured and replayed, were not a performative plea for sympathy. They were the natural consequence of watching reputation and relationships be dismantled, and realizing he'd contributed to that dismantling by being cautious when courage was required. There was a moment months later when journalists tracked him to a small private charity meeting where he spoke not as a prince of a dynasty, but as a man trying to right wrongs he had enabled. He read a statement that included apologies and an outline of how he intended to make restitution. For many, restitution did not erase the hurt. For others, it was the thin thread from which forgiveness might be woven, if ever. Sophia watched all of that from a distance that had become freer. She did not chase him to demand satisfaction. Her power came from the places she reclaimed. Control of her narrative, a legal vindication that the photo had been manufactured, and the quiet dignity of people who know what they are worth even when the world has been ugly. In a closing scene that felt like the settling of dust rather than a fireworks finale, Sophia attended a small fundraiser for the initiative she'd launched. The room was filled with real people who had been touched by similar injustices and with lawyers and journalists who had joined the moral side of this fight. She stood at the back for a moment and watched the crowd. Faces that had been once angrily curious were now quietly grateful. There was no triumphal smile. There was a calm that comes from having been through the crucible and coming out with purpose. A camera on a small news crew panned the room and caught a brief frame of Damien standing outside the venue in the rain. The camera caught him in profile, his face tilted down, the rain on his hair making him look more tired than shamed. He was alone. There were no dramatic confrontations. He was not being mocked. He looked like a man who had finally allowed himself to feel the consequences of his choices. The image that settled across screens later that night, the man who had once stood beside her now with tears streaking down his cheeks as rain joined them, did not make Sophia giddy. It simply closed a circle the city had been banging against for months. He was the one in tears. Not because she reveled in the spectacle, but because institutions and people who had once protected false narratives had been forced to account. A man who had once protected reputation over person was left to confront how much he'd cost. In time, apologies were offered, some sincere, some legal necessities. Trials concluded with sentences that reflected the seriousness of weaponizing reputation. The Stowe brothers served terms. Isabella faced civil suits and a public unraveling of her social power. Damien, chastened and more solitary, worked quietly in community programs, reading statements about responsibility and cataloging the harm his inaction had enabled. Sophia walked through this post-battle life with new muscles, a hardened patience, an ability to trust cautiously, and a refusal to accept that her value could be defined by a single photograph. She wore her jade pendant sometimes under a shirt, sometimes as if it were a flag. She accepted that scars do not vanish, but that scars can be maps to where healing happened. Friends like Ken and Layla were often at her side, not out of obligation but because they had chosen to be. There was a small ceremony months later when the charity she helped found awarded its first grant to a young woman who had been targeted by online smears. Sophia handed over the check with hands that did not shake. There were genuine, messy expressions of gratitude. There were no camera crews at the table where the women who had been through it all ate quietly afterward. That felt like vindication more than any headline. Any story of a comeback risks being told as neat, as if recovery were a single vertical arc. The truth is messier. There were days friends cancelled, nights she replayed what might have been, and moments she doubted the point of fighting. There were also legal bills and reporters who wanted simplified angles, and a society that loves an easy story. But the arc Sophia built was durable because she built it slowly and with people who understood the cost of rushing. On a winter evening, someone asked her if she forgave Damien. The question was less about sentiment and more about spectacle. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a process that sometimes takes the room it needs to heal. Sophia answered in a way that reflected everything she had become. I don't owe anyone absolution, she said. I owe myself truth. I owed myself a life that couldn't be edited away. He did cry. Damien did, in legal corridors and in private rooms, and once, briefly, in front of a camera that did not know how to hold a grief that wasn't a headline. Those tears did not change what had been done. They changed how people saw him, not as incorrigible but as painfully human and accountable. For Sophia, his tears were an echo of the truth she had fought to reveal, proof that time and evidence can force even the powerful to confront themselves. The last image is small and precise. Sophia on the roof of a modest building, a view of the city that had been her crucible. She turned the pendant between her fingers and watched lights blink on. A long way down, people rushed with their small dramas. Above them, the noise softened into the sound of her own breath. She had cried in the rain and been publicly diminished. She had been taken, humiliated, and nearly erased. But she had come back with proof, with allies, and with an agenda to make sure others did not suffer in silence. He had been the one in tears. She had become the woman who rebuilt. If this story moved you, like and subscribe, and watch another turnaround.